Policy Show. I'm your host, Jordan Bingham. GPS is a system of position navigation and timing satellites that's been around since the 1980s. Owned and operated by the US government, GPS has unquestionably brought changes to the way we live. In today's episode, GPS for Humanity, What's Next? Aerospace Technical Fellow Ranwa Haddad talks to the father of GPS, Professor Bradford Parkinson, about the future of PNT. Ranwa, over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Jordan. Brad, we are delighted to have you on today's Aerospace Space Policy Show.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to talk about my favorite subject.
Good. Yes, you have received over the years a lot of very impressive recognitions and awards, and the list includes the Institute of Navigation's Kepler Award, the Draper Prize, the Marconi Prize, the Queen Elizabeth II Prize in Engineering. And I found out recently that you also have an asteroid that's named after you. How cool is that?
Yeah, that last one was both a prize and a surprise because I'd never heard of such a thing, and I still haven't seen that asteroid.
It's very cool, though. So today we're going to talk about PNT. And first of all, Brad, I was wondering if you could describe for our audience, what is PNT, what is GPS, and what is GPS's place in the PNT landscape?
Position, navigation, and time. That's what PNT stands for. Positioning is where you are. Navigation is how you get to where you want to go. And time, of course, is the time that we all understand, except it's done in a very sophisticated way. Traditionally, the ancient mariners used the stars. They used looking at the land, called piloting, to figure out where they were. They used road maps. But today, we have a more sophisticated way, and that is GPS. Basically, what GPS is doing is very simple and understandable. We have a constellation of satellites. We know precisely where the satellite is, and the satellite is synchronized to a billionth of a second and sends a signal out. The user resolves that signal and determines how long it's taken to get to him, multiplies by the speed of light, and ends up with knowledge of how far exactly that star, that artificial GPS star, is from him. And if he listens to 4 together, it turns out he can determine latitude, longitude, altitude, and time, and use that for a variety of purposes, many of which we never envisioned. We had an idea of some of them, but fortunately, the innovation of humankind has expanded that envelope a great deal.
So for example, we know that GPS is used by the military, but it's also used by non-military. Was that non-military use a surprise, an accident, or was that by plan, by design?
That's a great question. It turns out when we designed the system, we realized that there was what we thought was going to be a very crude signal called the coarse signal. And it was used to acquire the more precise signal, which the military were supposed to use. But at the same time, that crude signal could be used for navigation purposes. And the federal government works in an interesting way. If you ask them a question, they assemble a committee and they all study what they should do about it. Well, I was running the GPS program. I was the original architect and advocate. And when we got the money, I announced to Congress and to everyone else that, of course, our system was going to have a civil capability. So the key to me was I never asked anyone whether we should. I simply explained that it was there and it was a benefit of GPS, or would be a benefit because civilians could use it. And the interesting side story is I published the specifications, our program office did, and they were distributed worldwide, unclassified. The first civil receiver to ever lock up on a GPS signal was built by students. Not only were they students, they were at a university in England called the University of Leeds, which emphasizes the point that from the very beginning, there was a non-guaranteed civil signal available for anyone who cared to use it. And a lot of the historical publications don't say it that way, but that is precisely what happened. And the evidence, of course, was in those young students, very bright students, who locked up on that signal and proclaimed to the world, it's there, which we liked.
And it is thanks to students and some of these innovative people that we've seen so many interesting emerging technologies, GPS applications in particular, right?
Yes, I think that is true. And I'm particularly proud of my students at Stanford because we pioneered a number of things. After I left the program and did a few things, I went to Stanford as a professor. And my research group pioneered, for example, the robotic steering of farm tractors, which I had vaguely thought might be done, the precise landing of airplanes, and the system of corrections now used by the FAA to determine that GPS is all right. It's called WAAS, Wide Area Augmentation System, or WAAS. But the point is that the students have added a lot of innovation, but so have the American and foreign industries in terms of what receivers do, how much they cost. The evolution has been absolutely astounding to me.
So we now have a dual use system in GPS. Should that continue? Should GPS continue to be a dual use system? And what challenges would there be in governing in the governance of a dual use system like GPS? Do you see any challenges there from a governance point of view?
That's really a very good and profound question. And the reason is we have a system. It is mostly funded by the military, and it is operated by the military. And by the way, I say that with great pride. I'm a former military person, but I say it for more than just the fact that I was associated with the military. Because in terms of reliability, in terms of the integrity of the signal, the ability of the signal to not lie, so to speak, the military has been absolutely superb. They have a special signal that they use, but they also recognize they are stewards of GPS, not just even for the United States, but for humanity. And they take that job very seriously, all the way up to the 4-star generals. But it does raise a problem. And that is occasionally civilians, the Department of Transportation, would like improvements, additions, things added to the system that would enhance its integrity or its robustness. And yet, because the military is doing the paying, there's a natural, enormous tension. The Department of Transportation does not have their own source of money, and this gets into space policy. And somehow the balance in terms of governance, access to resources, in my opinion, needs to be adjusted. And I'm hoping that we have something called the XCOM, the Executive Committee for Position, Navigation, and Time. And it is an opportunity to air issues, but it does not have a corresponding authority in terms of money and power. And those are the important things. I don't know what the right construct is, but frankly, I would like to see a stronger role in terms of the power and authority on the civil side. And I know that sounds strange coming from a former military guy, but I believe the balance is important.
So, and all while this is happening, many other countries are developing their own versions of GPS or have developed their own, what we call global navigation satellite systems, GNSS, including the European system Galileo, the Russian system GLONASS, the Chinese system Beidou, and some other regional systems. And oftentimes there are comparisons made and perhaps a little bit of competition. Should we be competing or collaborating? What's your view on GNSS and GPS's place in the GNSS landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. About 20 years ago, I was invited the United States government was trying to understand how we should react to, in particular, the European system coming along. The Russians had already fielded something, but it wasn't very reliable. But at this meeting, I think I astounded everyone. They thought I was a fervent GPS advocate, which I am. But at the same time, my statement was, no, you want to support Galileo and you want to ensure we have cooperation. It's more than simply being able to interoperate. I think that they should be interchangeable. I think for a civil user, a peaceful user, that a single receiver should be able to receive all the signals. Fortunately, that's happened. And now the little chips that cost $2 and go into your cell phone not only receive GPS, they receive the Russian system, but they also receive the European system. And as a consequence, your receiver is more robust. There is no system level problem that can keep a civil user from actually using and finding position. The most important element of navigating is, first of all, knowing where you are right now, and then knowing where you want to go in that same coordinate frame. It turns out this provides resilience. So I am personally a strong advocate for all of those other systems for peaceful use, but I'm also a skeptic in the sense that they have to prove their integrity. They have to prove that their system works reliably and we can depend on the signal. And fortunately, the FAA for our system monitors all those GPS satellites. And sleep well, public, because an airplane using GPS will have an alarm from the FAA, within 6 seconds if there's any problem with a given satellite. And that's what gives the FAA the confidence to use this system and use it for landing right straight down to the ground. Very interesting development.
And in fact, other countries also have their version of WAAS that monitors GPS over their territories as well, such as EGNOS over Europe, etc. And I know, Brad, you are a strong supporter of MultiGNSS, and you have been a participant in some of the UN sponsored activities. The International Committee on GNSS, you and I went to the last in-person ICG in Bangalore a couple of years ago. So yes, Brad, that's wonderful.
That is a great example of the way the system should operate. At the UN level, for example, we now know that we can use GPS and the other satellite systems to navigate satellites up in space to find out where they are. And the great development, in my opinion, is all of the 4 providers have come together to describe what capabilities one can depend on. And there is a common document that to me represents absolutely what should happen in terms of cooperation in space. And it recognizes that all of those satellite systems can provide help to the users, in this case, satellites or launch vehicles of all countries. I just think that's a very commendable development.
Yes. So I'm sorry, I mentioned an acronym, ICG, which stands for the International Committee on GNSS. That is the UN-sponsored body that is trying to ensure interoperability and compatibility between the different global navigation satellite systems. Okay, let's change the topic a tiny bit and talk about some of the challenges. We know that GPS, GNSS, and really all RF, radio frequency-based PNT systems are susceptible to interference and jamming. So what technical mitigations should be pursued in your opinion, and what policies should be pursued? Can you comment on that?
This is a very current and excellent subject to discuss a little bit. Let me give a little background, and that is that the GPS signal, when it comes down to your cell phone, has the following power: 1/10 of a millionth of a billionth of a watt. Just think about that. A tenth of a millionth of a billionth of a watt. And not only that, when it comes down, the background hiss that you hear when you tune to a radio station that isn't there, it turns out the background noise is 100 times bigger than the GPS signal. And somehow, it's a miracle. Somehow the technology is able to dig that signal out of the noise and use it reliably to give you better than meter accuracy. So at the same time, that begs an issue. If it is that small a signal, isn't it a little fragile? And it is. It can be jammed. And first of all, we have a construct that we use for the advisory board at the national level called Protect, Toughen, and Augment, PTA. And so we're walking right into policy issues that interact with protecting that spectrum. We're protecting the signal. If someone's deliberately interfering, we should find them. Secondly, making receivers tougher, more robust, better able to resist those noises, be they natural or be they created by someone with a hostile intent. And we know how to do this. We know how to make receivers almost immune to that. But if those two fail, there's also some activity looking how to augment GPS, not with capabilities fully equivalent, but with things that would be good enough, for example, to get an airplane on the ground if it were totally jammed. And these things are called ELORAN, long range aided navigation is the LORAN abbreviation. But the point is, there are alternatives that are being pursued to augment the knowledge of position, navigation, and time. And I think that's very commendable. There is one fly in this ointment. Perhaps the best unexploited way to do this is for GPS receivers, which are in essence providing high value knowledge to an airplane. There are techniques to make it more tough, as I mentioned. And the best way to do that may be a directional antenna. But it turns out the United States has put some constraints on that technology such that the manufacturers are not allowed to develop those capabilities. That is particularly sad because the knowledge of how to do it and the components to allow you to do it are all in the public domain and readily available. And without that constraint, I believe this would blossom and our PNT community would sleep better at night in the sense that they have the robust, reliable system in spite of jamming, in spite of someone seriously trying to overcome that, prevent you from having knowledge of your position.
Yes, Brad, I'm aware of this export control issue, and I'm under the impression that there is a group that is actually trying to change the policy there. You know, there have been a lot of talk about some of the non-radio frequency-based PNT technologies, inertial systems in particular, and how they can also help with the jamming problem. Do you have any thoughts on that? And in particular, do you see the non-RF PNT technologies ever replacing GPS?
Well, the crisp answer to the last part of your question is no, I don't see any of them having the capability of centimeters or millimeter accuracies that we get from GPS. On the other hand, having let me explain what an inertial system is. An inertial system is a device or a set of devices that are combined into a system that very accurately measure the force that is being applied to an airplane. And by measuring that force, they use Newton's laws, F equals ma, and they're able to sort out what the acceleration is. And by applying that, they can sum up the accelerations to get velocity and sum up the velocities to get position. In essence, that's what an inertial system does. In an ideal world, if you had total knowledge of gravity and good initial conditions, such a device, once initialized properly, would know forever where it is, and even if it's moving. But it turns out the practical reality is even the best of them are not going to be more accurate than a few hundred meters after 10 or 15 minutes. And so this is a long way of saying inertials and similar ideas have a role in spanning brief gaps in knowledge of where you are because GPS is interrupted or the signal is shaded, but they have no hope of totally replacing GPS.
Let's talk about the economic value that GPS brings. It has been estimated by NIST that GPS has generated roughly $1.7 trillion since 1980, and that losing GPS would cost the US economy approximately $1 billion per day. Was that ever anticipated when GPS was designed? And do you see it continuing?
Well, it was absolutely not anticipated. You have to put this in the context of 1978. And the cost of a GPS set, when we were building the initial ones, was about $250,000. And if you put that in the context today, the chip in your phone, as I mentioned, is about $2. It receives every satellite in view. You can literally receive 100 satellites at the same time. Back then, we could only receive 4 at a time. And the point is, the economics on the side of supplying position have plummeted. The consequence is the applications have expanded astronomically. And that is what has led to this revolution. I did not foresee that. In part, integrated circuits didn't exist in 1978. The very basis for a cell phone was not there. They had portable phones, but they were very, very kludgy devices. So the first answer is we don't even know all the applications. There are many, because the system is passive. You don't know where the users are. You don't know how many there are. And it is both a powerful advantage, but it promotes ignorance on how many people are using it and for what. I commend the studies that have been done. They are done on the basis of identified uses, and we have categorized 12 classes of uses. And within those, it ranges from very precise down to 1 millimeter, the width of a pencil lead, all the way up to needing position for perhaps a few tens of meters. But the net result for the user has been enormous benefits, first of all, economically, in terms of productivity. For example, when you use the steering ads or the steering suggestions that are made by a GPS receiver, you are saving money. You are finding the best way to get somewhere. You are reducing accidents because there's a voice in your ear that says, take the next right turn. But for example, being suddenly able to instrument every approach in the aircraft approach to landing in the United States with a single system that has been calibrated. Right now, there are more GPS approaches than there are using the old techniques. In Alaska, it's invaluable. So all of those productivity additions, and I could go on in that regard. The farmers could tell you the productivity is enormous in terms of improvements. They've all added up in subtle ways. It's been a stealth utility. It has crept into the economy in ways that were, frankly, not even foreseen by us zealots. And the net result is it's almost unthinkable that we would not have this. So first of all, and again, back to your second part of your question, no, I know of no replacement except other, the European system can do equivalently. But at the same time, what would happen should we lose it? An absolute disaster. So the economic benefit, and it's going to continue because bright people are inventing new ways to use it all the time.
It is a very powerful optimization system is how I view it. And if I may say, the fact that we published specifications for the signals openly, publicly, and guarantees about the performance encouraged and enabled the emergence of all these technologies that then improved productivity tremendously in all different sectors.
There's a policy issue. Could I just jump in, Ranwa, for a second?
Yeah, of course.
Because there is a substantial policy issue that largely the civilian population is not even aware of. So I told you when we started out, we said civilians could use the signal, but it was at risk. In other words, if it weren't there, it wasn't our fault. You were using it at your own risk. Take your own risk. Then remember, a Korean airliner was shot down, and he was judged that was caused by a navigation error. And the first policy statement that opened up the market for GPS was that President Reagan said, we, the United States, don't want that to happen again, and we are now going to guarantee GPS for at least the next 10 years, and that's a rolling carrot if you're thinking of a donkey chasing it, that 10 years is always in place. And that opened up a whole set of possible uses. But the second policy matter was at the early stages, the military would wiggle the accuracy of the civilian signal. And it would wiggle it back and forth around 100 meters or thereabouts. That was a technique that could be defeated, but nonetheless, it was a deterrent to use. And so President Clinton finally issued a decree and said, no, we were no longer going to do that. So there were two powerful policy-making decisions that really accelerated the market for the use of GPS. The first one saying would guarantee it, and the second one would say, and we're going to give it to you with a full accuracy. And a lot of people have benefited from that, especially when you go to a study such as the one you're commenting on.
I remember that. It was around 2000. President Clinton basically set selective availability off. How about climate change? Understanding the Earth environment and mitigating climate change is big now. How do PNT technologies play? Do they play a role there? Does GPS help with climate change? Can it help?
The answer is yes, in subtle ways. I'll give you an example that would never have occurred to me in the early days. And that is, we can use GPS in essence as a sounding rocket. And what do I mean? What I mean is this GPS signal passes through the atmosphere, and very bright people have understood that a satellite on the other side of the Earth receiving that signal can use that motion as that signal passes through the atmosphere to completely calibrate the column of air. And as a result, accurate meteorological measurements are enabled by GPS. And if you look into it, thousands and thousands of these measurements are taken every day by those people. And then in terms of impacts, tracking, for example, tuna fish. You say, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it turns out the migration patterns of tuna fish correspond to variations in the ocean temperature. And the tracking technique that is being used very prevalently and with great accuracy is using GPS, embedding a small transmitter in the back of a huge bluefin tuna and seeing where it goes. And watching those migratory patterns is very helpful. So, there are some other examples I could bring up. It's not a direct help. We're not going to turn off all fossil fuel use or something like that. But we are in a position to aid the scientists in understanding both the impacts and what the current situation is.
And perhaps even in reducing uses of some chemicals, like I'm thinking of the use of precision receivers to reduce the use of pesticides to the minimum needed in agriculture, as an example. Or even in aviation, minimizing the use of fuel by having more efficient routes, right?
Or perhaps automobiles. Yes, no, those are excellent examples. I didn't occur to me on the spot there, but obviously you're a student of this as well.
So now let's get to the big question, which is, what is the future of PNT? Where do you see the future of PNT? You know, there are some key technologies and developments happening, especially in the area of PLEOs and also launch vehicles. There are now some upcoming super heavy lift rockets that can put 100 tons in LEO. Do you see the combination of these emerging space technologies as playing into the future of PNT?
I think the potential is there, but frankly, when I focus on the future, I focus less on the provider side and more on the user side. And what I see happening is, again, an invasion of PNT. First of all, it went into the farming community. We pioneered some of that at Stanford, but it has since gone way beyond what we did with my students at Stanford. But what I see next, there are some imperatives. Let me give you a couple of examples. One example is helicopters. Right now, RPVs, remotely piloted helicopters, vehicles, are proliferating. They're used to inspect power lines. They're used to measure the soil moisture content. They're used as crop dusters. They're used all over the place. They have proliferated in a way that suddenly we have an air traffic control problem. GPS is a way of solving that problem and putting together allowable tunnels in the sky, for example, that such a vehicle could fly. But then you can look at integrity and you can say, well, if GPS is really good, maybe I can start to use it to carry people in helicopters completely autonomously. And I think the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, that's already being demonstrated, although there is a safety driver. But I'll give you another example of application looking at the future that is starting to be demonstrated. I've been preaching this one for at least 15 years, and that is for long-haul trucks. Long-haul trucks, the truck driver is the largest category of employment in the United States. Think about that. And if you drive one of the major interstates, every other truck that goes by says we're hiring drivers. And the reason is there's a shortage now, and it's projected to get much worse. A driver can only sit in that truck 12 hours at a time. And if you've ever driven 12 hours, I don't envy them that job at all. But the point is they are already demonstrating, and Daimler-Benz, for example, has a vehicle, a huge 18-wheel semi that has demonstrated cross-country driving without a person at the wheel. There is a safety driver yet. But the point is, all of a sudden, we would have trucks that can run for 24 hours a day. They will run very fuel efficiently because you won't have a heavy-footed person wiggling the throttle up and down. And the net result is enormous productivity saving, but it needs integrity. It needs insurance that will need a variety of sensors. Well, you're already seeing that in automobiles. My wife recently bought a new automobile, and it absolutely astonishes me. It's got lasers, and it's got televisions, and it's got lane keeping, and it's got all these things. Well, those are the precursors of a reliable, automatic, long-range truck driving system that is coming. And I predict within 10 years, we're going to start to see this really proliferate. And it will have an enormous payoff in terms of the cost of transporting things and in terms of the reliability. There is embedded in this, not just productivity gains, but also some very heavy policy matters. The policy of allowing those trucks to drive on the roads. I could envision us taking a lot of the large freeways and adding or dedicating a lane simply to robotic trucking and letting that drive along at 55 miles an hour and not bother anyone. And if you get in there, you're in a convoy, you lock in. By the way, they have shown that that saves 10 to 15% of the fuel if they do that. You could envision them being in a convoy, driving down the road, the cars in the other lanes, not, happy as clams, because these trucks would not be interfering with them in any way. And furthermore, they would have knowledge that these trucks are very, very safe, safer than they would be with a human driver. So I do not tend to come from the provider or augmentation so much as I come from the side of, well, what can we exploit that we haven't exploited up to now?
I love this idea of autonomous vehicle technologies applied to trucks with assured integrity, obviously, and safety of life. I look forward to the day when I can drive from Los Angeles to Phoenix on the 10 freeway without worrying about these pesky trucks. So I think we've talked about many of the PNT challenges. Do you see any other challenges that we haven't talked about that PNT
There's always
faces?
been, good question. There's always been an underlying challenge that in the early days we didn't recognize because we didn't realize PNT, i.e. GPS receivers, would be so cheap and so ubiquitous. But now that they are, there is a very serious issue that relates to privacy. And in many cases, people, I think, are being tracked without their knowledge. If you try to do that as a law enforcement officer, you cannot track anyone. And the Supreme Court has come down on this, by the way, as a policy issue. You cannot track anyone without getting a warrant or with their permission. And I think the warrant is the check and balance that we need, that someone has to go before the judicial arm and say, we want to track this person and here's why. And it better be a valid reason in the public good, not because of a capricious interest. And to me, that's an example of a kind of downside. Almost every great technical development has some downsides. You know, bridges might fall down, and occasionally they do, and airplanes crash, but very infrequently now. But the point is, in the case of GPS, one of the things that I occasionally worry about is this whole business of privacy.
Brad, thank you very much for a very informative and inspiring conversation. Thank you for being with us on today's Space Policy Show.
Well, you are entirely welcome. And as you can sense, this is a subject that I'm pretty fervent about.
Thank you again. Okay, back to you, Jordan.
Thank you both for that dive into the future of PNT and the role of GPS. Our executive producers, Colleen Stover, and our technical directors, James Liggins. You can find more of our shows at csps.aerospace.org and check us out on Twitter using #TheSpacePolicyShow. Thank you for joining us.